I'm Ann Simmons for the Los Angeles Times. Nelson Mandela, one of the world's most revered statesmen, a courageous revolutionary and astute politician, led the fight to dismantle South Africa's racist apartheid regime and established a multiracial democracy. He was imprisoned for 27 years by a white minority government that condemned him as a terrorist. His incarceration damaged his health, but it did not break his spirit. 4 years after his release from prison, Mandela became South Africa's first black president. He won praise for casting aside resentment towards his Afrikaner repressors and for pushing national reconciliation and racial harmony. For these efforts, he won a Nobel Peace Prize. Times deputy managing editor Scott Kraft spent 5 years as the paper's Johannesburg bureau chief between 1988 and 1993. He joins me today to talk about the formidable role that Nelson Mandela played in creating a new South Africa and about his experiences as a foreign correspondent working under apartheid. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you.
Let's begin with, what was the atmosphere like when you first arrived in South Africa in the late 1980s? What were the political and racial dynamics?
Well, it was a very tense period, as you can imagine. Nelson Mandela's group, the African National Congress, was still a banned organization, and it was conducting or waging a guerrilla war against the white government. It was a very low-level guerrilla war, but shortly after I arrived in the country, there was a bomb that was set off at a rugby stadium by the ANC, which killed several white civilians, which was unusual, actually, at that time. Still, even shopping malls, most grocery stores, things like that, when you would go into them, you had to go through a metal detector. So there was a lot of fear in the country. For their part, the whites were also growing increasingly frustrated with the system, and they felt like the world pariah. And therefore, I think they were starting to get their heads around a new kind of dispensation, a new constitution, but they didn't know whether it would be 2 years away or 20 years away.
So was there any indication at that particular juncture that Mandela might be released and it would be just 2 years to his release?
Well, there were always rumors at that time, and actually throughout the apartheid era, rumors of the release of political prisoners. In fact, I think the process that led to his release, in my mind, began about a year before. The president of South Africa at the time, P.W. Botha, had suffered a stroke. It turned out not to be fatal, but it was enough for the National Party, which was then in power at the time, to replace him. And they put in a guy named Frederick W. de Klerk. At the time, most political analysts felt like de Klerk was actually more conservative, or at least as conservative as Botha. But they turned out to be wrong. And about 10 months into his tenure, in late 1989, he began dismantling some of the apartheid laws. And in October of 1989, which was about 4 or 5 months before Mandela was released, something remarkable happened. He released several of the men who had been defendants with Mandela back in the Rivonia treason trial.
Right.
And I remember that morning very well because we all went to Soweto to meet them, and they came with a police escort. And these were men who had not been seen in South Africa in 25 years. And they were in their 60s and 70s, and they were graying and stooped. And it was a remarkable moment. And then we found out later, of course, that Mandela himself had negotiated with the government for their release and wanted them to go first.
And of course, Mandela then is released in 1990, in February of 1990, and then becomes South Africa's first black president in 1994. How would you characterize his tenure as president? Was he able, for example, to foster the type of national reconciliation and racial harmony that he so sought?
Well, I think he was pretty successful in that. It was quite a task at that time, as you can imagine. And of course, 4 years passed before he became president. And during that period, he had to negotiate with the white government. He had to make a lot of compromises to make that work. And by the time he then became president, I think the country was ready for him. But the country was not quite ready to just change overnight.
And of course, there was some criticism of Mandela. Even this icon wasn't kind of protected from criticism. There were those, for example, who said that he should have been a bit firmer or not so forgiving of the white population because of the misery that they had caused black South Africans. Did he really have any choice but to become the so-called reconciler-in-chief, if you wish?
He probably didn't. But it is you make a very good point. He did get a lot of criticism, especially from the left, from other more radical blacks who felt that he was not moving fast enough to redress things that they felt needed to be redressed, like land ownership, redistribution of wealth. And he felt that if he continued to keep whites on his side as well, that could happen. I think one of the reasons he could be the reconciler-in-chief was because he had the credibility of having been in prison for all of those years. Not many people could have done that.
Would you say then that it was that really tied him to the masses? I mean, he was so popular, and he was royalty after all. Where did that connection come from?
Well, I think it's important to remember that most leaders of the ANC and of the liberation movement in South Africa were royalty or were part of the elite. They tended to be the lawyers and doctors and people like that. So it wasn't that unusual for Mandela as a lawyer to have been a leader of that. But I think more than that, the 27 years he spent in prison was important. It gave him the credibility he needed in order to sell his agenda later. But also, generations of liberation leaders went to prison and they learned at his knees, so to speak. And they also learned, they began to inculcate some of the values that he had, I think, which was a respect for all South Africans of all races.
But his popularity transcended borders. To what extent, what kind of influence did Mandela have in other parts of the world?
Well, it's interesting. I don't think he had all that much influence outside of South Africa. He was a beloved figure in the West, particularly in the United States and in Europe. But he had much less influence in the rest of Africa. Part of that is a reason of history. South Africa was so different from those other countries. It had an indigenous white population that really didn't have another country to go to. It wasn't a colonial kind of arrangement, but it was, these were people who felt they were part of South Africa. And they were a minority, but they were a large minority. So what Mandela had to deal with there was very different from most other countries in Africa. Also, I think the other countries in Africa were a little suspicious of South Africa's economic power and its power to have an influence on the world stage. And I think they weren't really that keen to listen to Mandela.
And just wrapping up, in later years, of course, he wasn't politically active, he wasn't the president. So ultimately, what will his death mean to South Africa?
Well, I think he's obviously a very beloved, iconic figure in South African history. And long after he stopped speaking in public, his very presence had kind of a calming influence on the country. We'll have to see what happens. I don't anticipate any particular difficulty after his death, but I do think that the fact that he existed, the fact that the presidents, his successors, could go visit him and be seen to be visiting him, I think gave South Africans a kind of sense of calm and a sense that things would be okay.
Such an incredible figure. Thank you so much, Scott, for your insight. For more on the life and legacy of Nelson Mandela, please visit latimes.com.